According to Barack Obama, climate change is no longer some far off problem. It is happening here and it is happening now. Observations throughout the world make it clear that climate change is occurring. Warming temperatures, shorter ice cover in boreal lakes and rivers, long term shifts in rainfall patterns, glacial melt, and increased frequency of extreme climatic events. Terrifying, if you'll ask me. But do you have any idea how climate change influences the integrity of our freshwater ecosystem? A bit? Well, we're more than glad to feed you with more information on how fresh waters are affected by climate change, the role of this body of water in this worsening situation, the shifts in temporal and spatial scales, the influences on the population up to even the community level if there is, and what are the measures we can do to mitigate the outstandingly detrimental impacts of climate change. So, are you ready now? Let's start.
The first thing you need to understand is that there are two fundamental facts to explain how freshwater ecosystems will be affected by climate change. First, the global hydrological cycle is driven by warmth from solar radiation. And second, most freshwater animals are ectothermic or cold-blooded. Therefore, the effects of warming on the freshwater biota will surely be ubiquitous. Do you have any idea why? Try writing your answers in the comment section down below. Well, the metabolic rates of fishes scale directly with water temperature. Thus, they will require more oxygen under warmer conditions where it is less available. This will have broader implications for their overall metabolism and growth. Moreover, sensitivity to pollutants is temperature related, as chemical toxicity is exacerbated when conditions are warmer. And you know what's worse? Vulnerability will be increased as many species living in isolated inland water bodies have limited abilities to disperse as the environment changes. Indeed, a terrifying scenario to hear. Yet, it's already happening. But surprisingly, in certain circumstances, freshwater animals can adapt to warming. For instance, let's take a look at Daphnia magna's case. They reproduce asexually under good conditions, but undergo sexual reproduction under stressful conditions. They also have the genetic capacity to evolve even greater tolerance to future warming. Thermal shock experiments revealed that more recent genotypes exhibited higher thermal tolerance than older subpopulations. This suggests that temperature plays the role of a selective agent in evolution. If that's the case, surely different species will have varied response to climate change, right? Just like any battle, our fight with climate change will have winners and losers. As mentioned earlier, most freshwater animals are ectothermic or cold-blooded, making them vulnerable to the effects of climate change. Now, does anyone know why warm-blooded animals are less vulnerable to the effects of climate change? I'll give you 5 seconds to think. That's right! It's because warm-blooded animals are able to regulate their own body temperature while cold-blooded animals cannot. That's why it's important to study about ectotherms that are very much at risk. However, this is easier said than done as data for ectotherms, especially for tropical ectotherms, are lacking. The best thing we can do is extrapolate data from their temperate relatives, but again, that may be inaccurate since tropical ectotherms are already close to their upper tolerance limit in temperature. They are the losers when it comes to climate change. In amphibians and other aquatic invertebrates, a decrease in body size in metamorphosis is observed when this tolerance limit is reached. This results in reduced adult fitness, which lessens survivability. Species that are specialists, which have complex life history, restricted range, and strict habitat requirements, will be hit harder by climate change. An example is the endangered pearly mussels, which are known to be highly temperature sensitive. They are specialists that are even driven faster to extinction by a niche consumption by a certain fish species. If climate change proceeds, these pearly mussels may unfortunately disappear from our fresh waters. Let's move on to the winners. Species that are generalists in their habitat and diet and have the capacity to move from one place to another may have a stronger chance of survival. An example are rainbow trouts that can migrate upstream to cooler or higher elevations when temperature in their original habitat rises. However, There's a problem to this as dispersal barriers such as dams hinders this mechanism. So let me ask you this. Do you think that there will really be winners in climate change? Whatever your answer is, I agree with you. But for me, there will be no winners in climate change. The increasing adaptation of freshwater species to warmer temperatures will cause a loss in biodiversity. This will be discussed next.
We all see how our current ecosystems are exposed to numerous anthropogenic stressors, which will drive the future land use changes and nutrient loading. We as humans give rise to indirect impact on biodiversity that we thought we are only scarring a small part of the ecosystems, when in fact the consequences of our actions can be or will be greater than the direct effects of unpredictable change. So do you have any idea what are the consequences of climate change? Yes, the warming and rising acidity of the waters, which threatens the freshwater ecosystem that can cause a significant population to decline by reducing suitable habitats. This narrows the fish range of our system since warming is more apparent at lower elevations by intensifying the toxicity of some contaminants on other freshwater animals, while acidity is a threat in higher elevation with less well-buffered waters. So for example, the brook trout and sculpins, because of the warming of the headwater streams, they shift to higher elevation streams to a cooler temperature, although they will need to counter the acidification in the environment. Back in 2006, the earliest literary review about ecological and evolutionary responses to climate change only mentioned little about freshwaters, but they focus on the loss of thermal habitat of some salmonids. After a few years, climate change is very evident in our freshwaters, which changes the levels of organism, population, and communities. Local extinction in freshwater ecosystems were much higher than marine habitat. Due to the climate change, since marine fishes has a capacity to adjust temperatures in water columns, while freshwater fishes are limited to inland waters, hindering them to adjust and adapt to the warming. When humans clear the riparian forest and when alien species are allowed to establish in this habitat, this affects on the warming of the stream and creates suitable conditions to invasive piscivores that harm species such as the stenothermic salmonids. The wetlands humans clear and alter by cutting mangroves and mismanaging the ecosystems transform them from carbon sinks to carbon sources, which is significantly responsible for global warming. Furthermore, this climate change will create water supply shortages and floods that can threaten human life. What do you think the solution do you think we can have to mitigate this problem? Right. We would need engineering solutions to mitigate these problems, from new dams, levees, to water diversions, to enhance the water security for everyone, and demand to shift to new hydropower facilities will increase to reduce using fossil fuels that also contribute to climate change. So dams retain 5 times the volume of Earth's rivers, countering other effects of the dams. Its purpose should ensure the sufficient water to sustain ecosystem and biodiversity in the downstream. Are there other options and solutions you can think of? Yes, that's right. Maybe another option in water resource management is the restoration of the riparian habitats that can reduce nutrient loads and provide shade, mitigating climate change impacts and land use transformation on freshwater biota.
For this part of our talk, we are going to talk about lakes being a sentinel ecosystem. Now, can anyone tell me what they think a sentinel ecosystem is? Very good, everyone. A sentinel ecosystem is sensitive to temperature and can respond rapidly and integrate information about changes in the catchment or the collection of water in a natural drainage system. Climate-related signals and shifts in timing of the ice coverage can be measured in a lake system, while other changes can be detected through paleolimnological examination of sediment cores. Lake Baikal in southeast Siberia is an excellent example of a sentinel ecosystem, wherein you can see the different relationships between the freshwater species and the climate. For example, the summer phytoplankton abundance is positively correlated with the long-term warming trend. Epilimnetic warming increases the temperature differences between surface and deeper waters. This reduces mixing and restricts nutrient availability for phytoplankton species. With long-term weathering, it can jeopardize endemic cold water stepnotherms who are unable to adapt physiologically or behaviorally to the new temperature changes. Another example of a sentinel ecosystem is Lake Tanganyika in Eastern Africa. In that ecosystem, the warmer water over the century has enhanced the water column stability and reduced vertical mixing of nutrients. This limits primary production in algal biomass. The consequences of this constant warming is that there is a decline in lake fisheries, and the constant warming will exacerbate stratification and can be expected to increase the extent of benthic habitat loss, particularly in deep water specialist fishes and invertebrates. Now, a question for you all. What were the two examples of sentinel ecosystems discussed in this section? Yes, that is correct. Lake Baikal and Lake Tanganyika are the two examples of sentinel ecosystems. Now, the different response of these two ancient lakes to climatic forcing is an example of the dependence of response variables to the local or geographical contents of the sentinel lake.
Climate change has now even reached to the point where we can see by our normal eyes. Can anyone know what physical shifts have taken place in streams and rivers? Yes, that's right. Signs of climate change in running waters include a consistent trend in stream warming, wherein approximately 0.2 degrees Celsius per decade was increased. And high air temperatures was the dominant factor accounting for both long-term trends and interannual variability in stream temperature. On the local scale, warming effects are due to land use change and riparian clearance, while on a global scale, direct carbon dioxide signals have been detected in continental runoff, wherein it increased human water consumption and suppression of plant transpiration due to elevated atmospheric carbon dioxide concentrations. Global vegetation and hydrology was conducted to quantify the contributions of shifts in climate, carbon dioxide levels, and land use to changes in river discharge or Q, wherein higher Q is associated with the elevation of carbon dioxide concentration and land use changes, mainly deforestation. Also, global warming and irrigation were associated with the discernible reductions in discharge. Okay, what do you guys think are the main influences in creating climate change? Yep, that's right. Human-caused pollutants or anthropogenic influences. Continuation of these problems, there will be several consequences that would happen to our streams and rivers, because streams are more susceptible than larger rivers to low flows, and these cause more closely tracked air temperature than large rivers, and biota are vulnerable to short-term extremes such as heat waves. One finding about freshwater ecosystem is that floods that formerly had a return time of 100 years can be expected to occur more frequently than once in a century, and extreme flow events that might have taken place on average once in a decade may occur twice or more within a 10-year period. Thus, non-stationarity exposes the riverine biota to hydrological regimes that differ for those to which they have adapted, and the imperative to find engineering solutions to increase predictability and restore stationarity for humans.
We have already seen the physical shifts that occurred in freshwater, but do you know the extent of impacts of climate change on our clinology, life histories, and population dynamics? Well, this may sound complex, but let me give you a brief explanation and example. First, climate change has been implicated as a leading cause of the growth of small planktonic diatoms that have been observed in several relatively oligotrophic lakes, a lake that has low productivity due to the low nutrient content. This is because the variation in lake physical properties that affect phytoplankton populations will, in turn, have a substantial influence on the phenology and population dynamics of zooplankton. Second, various lines of evidence suggest that reduced body size is a frequent response to climate warming, with increases in the proportion of small species, a decrease in size and age, and a higher proportion of younger age classes in freshwater fishes, phytoplankton, and zooplankton. Although smaller body size and reduced fitness is a common response of ectotherms to rising temperatures, actual outcomes are not always as binary as the winner and loser dichotomy might suggest. For instance, projected temperature increases are expected to enhance the growth of some salmonoids during the spring but have the opposite effect in the summer. And there is experimental evidence of significant sublethal costs of warming in terms of salmonoid growth, metabolism, development, and disease resistance. Elevated temperatures also tend to favor fish parasites. Lastly, it is not only the variability of local conditions that limit our ability to generalize about the influence of climate across the entire geographical range of a species of interest, but also the various effects of warming on life histories. One example is the yellow perch in Lake Erie, which grows more rapidly during the short winters resulting from climate change, but eggs produced in long-term winter conditions are up to 40% larger and have 2 to 4-fold greater success than the one produced in the short winters. Okay, now a quick Q&A. What do you think are the impacts of the situation in yellow perch? Write your answers now. You got the point. Yes, the larvae produced in short winters are smaller and more vulnerable to predation with low survival. So, after knowing all of these, aren't you curious about the effects of this phenomenon on species distribution? Well, let's head on to the next section.
Climate warming can be both a gradually varying driver of ecological change and also an inducer of abrupt ecosystem shock. So in this section, it answers one question: what are the effects on distribution of aquatic species? However, the limited availability of data in species distribution hinders our ability to investigate the range shifts by many freshwater species. Fortunately, many studies about observed changes in fish distribution as a result of climate change may have done. What do you think is the importance of this study about changes in fish distribution by climate change? That's correct. This projects future distribution of species when affected by temperature and precipitation. For example, there will be an uphill movement of amphibians under climatic warming, and this is one kind of adaptation by amphibians to cope with warming temperature. Okay, are you now interested with these surprising findings? There are various types of studies to predict this kind of change by species. One type of these studies is global meta-analysis. It helps us know the freshwater fish distribution that have been affected by contemporary climate change in ways consistent with anticipated responses under future climate change scenarios. From these kind of studies, we were able to know the future predictions of distribution in species. For example, what do you think will the cold water species move when there is a warming in water? Yup, cold water species will experience range expansion, eventually moving to colder places. So we can see one of many effects of climate change, which is the shifting of distributional limits of fishes. This is quite sad, but this can involve colonizations and extirpations, counterbalancing roles in the reshuffling of communities. With this, there could be a reduction in functional diversity of fish assemblages because species will be dominated with shared disturbance tolerance traits. We can see distributional change due to climate change from freshwater macroinvertebrates because they are more responsive to these changes. Also, similarly, alpine microinvertebrates are cold water dependent who retreat upstream in search of higher, cooler habitat directly downstream of retreating glaciers. Trait-based approach considers the organism's traits rather than individual species that have helped us see the early responses to changes in the functional structure rather than the taxonomic structure of a community. Of course, this determines that there is a congruence between exposure and sensitivity to climate change. Now, a surprise question for you guys. Do you know what are some examples of these field observations to see direct changes? You are all correct. Another example is feeding specialism, which depends on high altitude and sensitivity to temperature. Therefore, trait-based approach is good for planning and implementing management and conservation strategies. Therefore, a sudden rise in temperature and acidification can lead to the loss of habitats and species. Also, it reduces the abundance and distribution of wild fish stocks in lakes by reducing water quality and may change prey abundance for fish.
The question now is, can we attribute community level effects to climate change? Well, due to the overarching effect of temperature on metabolism, activity, feeding interactions, growth shifts in species distribution, and many more, this will scale up to affect community composition. So, yes, the indirect effects will accompany direct consequences on interspecific interactions and changes in competitive dominance that will eventually influence food webs and ecosystem functioning. To be specific, the higher temperatures and altered hydrology will shift resource availabilities, temporal and spatial synchrony. What does it mean? Well, sadly, once it happens, there will be a mismatch between the phenology of consumers and that of their resources, scaling from populations to communities and ecosystems. Now, I want to test your knowledge. How does climate change influence the freshwater ecosystem? I'll give you 5 seconds. Write your answer down below. The time is up. You got it right. But to be precise, climate change is simply one of a panoply of threats to fresh waters. The influence of climate change may appear slight in relevance to eutrophication, as warming amplifies the effects of this phenomenon. It also facilitates the range spread of invasive species, pollution, and so on. Therefore, we need to keep in mind the community-level effects of climate change will involve multiple species, each of which may be affected by primary and secondary responses of other species, or even by tertiary or quaternary responses. However, despite the severity of its influence, the gradual and pervasive effects of climate change may well be overlooked or disregarded when faced with more egregious outcomes of human mismanagement of fresh waters. And we cannot deny this fact that it's happening. Hence, community modification lags far behind the rate at which it occurs in nature. For that reason, this raises our last question.
Now, the only thing that's left to know is what can be done. What can be done as a solution to our current problem? An answer could be the translocation or assisted migration of the species at risk from warming to a more suitable body of water similar to their thermal range. But with this, there are some cons, with one being that it is costly, wherein it requires a detailed information about the life history and physiological tolerances of the species that are to be moved, and is only available for a small fraction of freshwater species. Aside from that, it can also be very controversial, since there is a potential risk of ecological outcomes with the spread of species to environments beyond their natural geographical distribution. In order for this to be implemented, the outcomes need to be predicted on a robust risk assessments. Now, a question for you. What type of model would be best used to identify the possible sites for translocation? That's right. A species distribution model is correct. A species distribution model can be used to make predictions about the availability of the thermal habitat for species that may be threatened by climatic warming. This type of model uses present-day relationships between occurrences and temperature in order to predict the future ranges based on particular climate change scenarios. With that being said, sites that are the most suitable for translocation of freshwater species can be identified using this type of model. And now, that ends our talk about climate change and how it affects our lakes. I hope you learned something valuable today and make it a great day.